We'll go straight to it. U.S. President-elect Joe Biden has pledged to take the country back to the Paris Climate Accord on the first day of office as president. That means America is just about 8 days away from resuming our elevated role in implementing an agreement which has been described by the environmental activists as the most realistic chance of saving the Earth's ecosystem from irreversible destruction. Here in Nigeria, there is still no end in sight to the long-standing problems of environmental damage, particularly in the Niger Delta. How urgent does it become for international community to devote greater attention towards disappearing environmental ecosystems? So joining us now to have a discussion on this is Akin Oluwafemi, Executive Director, Corporate Accountability and Public Participation Africa. It's a pleasure having you to the program. It's great to talk about this, that America might be having the time back at the Paris Climate Agreement. But when you look at other countries, especially in Africa and in Nigeria, the challenges are still there. Somebody once went to Port Harcourt and was telling me about the soot problem, how people are inhaling soot in Port Harcourt. Nigerian cities rank among the dirtiest cities in the world. Environmental degradation everywhere had missed the constant release of ecological funds that have been plundered away in corruption. There is an ecological imbalance waiting to happen. Seismic activities here and there in other parts of the country. What's your take on all of this bedeviling Nigeria?
Well, good morning. It's very good that we're starting from Nigeria because, as our common saying goes, charity, starts from home. Climate change is a global phenomenon, and every country do have a responsibility to their own people to protect them from the damages and ill health that are coming out of the environment. Nigeria's Niger Delta has become the emblem of environmental degradation caused by oil multinationals, and that you've rightly said. Till now, we've not seen any concrete action from the Nigerian government. Reports after reports about the ill health that the soot in Port Harcourt is causing. There have been cases of fishes being washed ashore. No report, no action by the Nigerian government. Since September, an oil well belonging to Cornell has been spilling around Akasa, Brass, and all those parts of the Niger Delta. Nothing is being done, reports after reports. So the point is, while we are looking at the global conventions that are trying to regulate the environment, we as Nigerian citizens need to hold our government accountable relating to our environment. Let me tell you this. Just this week, a tanker with about 44,000 of diesel exploded at Toyota bus stop in Lagos. And, we have that burnt and whatever smokes and the rest of them. No one is talking about the health impact of this on the citizens. No one is, I heard the government talking about conducting assessment on the bridge and closing the bridge. We won't see anybody, particularly from government, doing anything about that. We know about, the explosion in Lagos and the multiple, effects on businesses. People were killed and the rest of them. There was a BBC report that actually placed that on the negligence on the part of the NNPC. Nobody is being held accountable. I think that the Nigerian government needs to wake up to the problem of the environment. More so that we are seeing the linkages between environment and public health, as we're being now taught by COVID-19 and the pandemic.
Well, Femi, quickly, let me ask you, one of the major priorities announced by President-elect Joe Biden of the United States is that one of his first assignments in office will be to take the United States back to the Paris Climate Agreement. You'll recall that President Trump had taken the U.S. out of that accord, claiming America first, and the damage that agreement, in his view, does to American businesses. And now he has Vice President Biden, former Vice President, has chosen Senator John Kerry, who signed the original agreement on behalf of the United States in 2016 as a special envoy on this climate change process. Now, if the United States goes back to that Paris Accord, what is the significance? What does it mean for that accord that was signed by about 195 countries of the world?
So thanks, Dr. Abati. We need to remind ourselves about the significance of the Paris Agreement in the first instance. That was one of the boldest and the most successful meeting, despite its shortcomings, about tackling the climate change phenomenon. What is it about? Is that countries around the world, and about 180 plus of them are now parties to that agreement, should begin to take adaptation actions, to begin to take measures. They should begin to, put resources and energy into slowing down every action that is rising, that is causing rise in climate temperature. And the target was to reduce temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade pre-industrial level, or at best 1.5. And there are actions that countries around the world are supposed to take. There is what is called intended determined contribution. Every year, countries around the world are supposed to meet and say, okay, this is how far we are going in that action. And a lot of countries around the world, the big polluters committed to that, including the United States of America. And then President Trump, whose tenure was an international, a nightmare, and it just came up and said, oh, we are pulling the United States out of that agreement. It basically means that whole action in the United States as a country towards, ensuring that we have that reduction is put on hold. Most significantly is the fact that the United States is supposed to be contributing, financial resources. We're talking about how to change our ways of development. We're talking about technology shifts. We're talking about adaptation. That has to be funded. Funding climate change has been a very big issue, to the extent that some of us as campaigners have been asking that the big polluters should pay for that. So the U.S. is committed to, I think, then about $3 billion, which President Trump was pulling out of the table, just as he's pulling out funds from WHO even during the pandemic. So we are expecting that with a Joe Biden, we'll begin to see the United States back on the table for those kind of discussion that is going to move the climate talks forward. We are not only looking at the U.S. joining or coming back to the UNFCCC, but in terms of the domestic actions, when you study it very closely, some of those Obama-era, regulations and legislations that were aimed at curbing emission, at regulating the automobile industry, Trump reversed all of them. And Joe Biden did not only appoint John Kerry as his climate czar, he has also pulled a woman, Gina McCarthy, who has sued the Trump administration for close to 100 times over environmental issues, now to oversee the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So we are hopeful. We think that Biden might not be a quick fix, but we might be back on the road towards the United States contributing its parts towards, addressing climate change problems globally.
Well, not to take away from that excitement and commitment, because I was just going to ask you, yes, we are seeing increased commitment, and we've been promised commitments by the US, the UK, EU, and even China at some point. But is that enough to be hopeful about the environment? The big polluters are still the biggest polluters.
Now, see, when it comes to serious action, we think that the most significant thing we should do when we recognize that we have a problem, we look back to say, who are the people? What caused this problem? And so we realize that the biggest polluters, the whole multinationals, the agro-businesses around the world, who pollute the most, should be held accountable. This is cultural. It's logical that when you commit an offense, when you commit an infraction, you must recompense for it. You must pay for it. These guys have to slow down have to stop their development or business model. Not only that, they have to pay for their historical pollution that is causing the climate warming that we have in. So all countries around the world now, we are engaging governments to begin to look at what we call, liability. How do we make them to pay for those infractions? Whether we will not only rely on our taxpayers' money, but corporations like Shell, like Chevron, like the rest of them around the world that are polluting should be made to pay for, the damages they've done to our environment.
Getting them to pay is another big problem. I mean, you mentioned a company now that had a long, drawn-out legal battle as regards, payment for a certain oil spill, and that has been around for a very long time. In fact, they had to seek jurisdiction abroad. Prosecuting the multinationals in Nigeria is another question around environmental law and its statistics in the country. But some other people are making the argument. They're saying it's easy for the West to say we can cut carbon emissions, we can hit carbon targets and the likes, and all the good things like an Al Gore will say, because the West has industrialized. They're saying for African countries, we have not industrialized. And they'll say, isn't this the time for Africa to be protectionist? Because when you even look at the world and look at where most of the carbon is coming from, that are, increasing the depletion of the ozone layer and the likes, it's coming from economies like China. Like, you can't move around without wearing a face mask, even before coronavirus in China, because of the massive pollution. It's not us doing all the work. What do you say to these arguments people make?
Thanks very much. That's a very common argument, and sometimes I laugh because, none of us want to ride rally motorcycle again. I mean, that was what our grandfather rode, and at some point they were riding that also in the Western world. Everybody now is talking about how does a Tesla vehicle looks like. The technology for development itself is changing. What we are saying is that they shouldn't turn Africa to dumping ground of archaic, polluting modes of development. And that, the UN in general laid out a 6-point agenda. And one of them is that no one should be left behind. And so in moving towards the modern development, Africa should not be a dumping ground because, as you rightly said, we are already at the receiving end of, the climate crisis that we are in today. We are the least prepared to address climate problem. Financially, we're not there. And so we shouldn't also be, contributing to some of those problems. So I think what Africa needs to do is, if there is, let me say, a ditch that climate change has become, and some, jumped into it, I think we should look at that ditch and walk away and walk to a better economy that our great-grandfathers had practiced, and avoid the ill health, the climate catastrophe that climate change is foisting on the world.
Well, Akinbode, if you look at the situation, say, in Nigeria, every year when the Nigerian president goes to the UN General Assembly, there's always a paragraph about commitment to climate change in it. Well, that's the time I hear about it on an annual basis. And then, of course, for the rest of the year, I wait for the next United Nations General Assembly. Are you aware of certain concrete steps being taken by Nigeria to address climate change and the challenges, apart from occasional references to desertification or the Lake Chad Basin or the Ogoni oil spill that we've been talking about perennially for years? But we don't have more time. We'll need to take a short break. And then when we return, you can respond to that question. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show here on the Arise News channel. Still with us is Akin Oluwafemi, Executive Director of Corporate Accountability and Public Participation in Africa, who's been talking about climate change, both internationally and also here in Nigeria. Thank you, Femi Akinbode, for staying with us. Well, I'd asked you a question about Nigeria's national response strategy to climate change. How robust is it? How weak is it at the federal and state levels, considering that we're the second most impacted country in Africa with regard to climate change implications?
So, Doctor, some of us do joke because we made reference to speeches by our presidents at the UN. So we do joke that 3 hours after, if you tap some of these our president and say, what have you just read? What are the key highlights? Some of them may not even be able to respond to those things because, as you rightly know, some of those speeches are written by technical officers in government establishments. So in about an hour's time, the Ministry of Finance will be doing what they call the public presentation of the 2021 bill to Nigerians. And year in, year out, we have noticed that, environment looks like an appendix to the Nigerian government. Very limited budget. The Environment Ministry has a lot to do. And we have cried out several times that budgetary allocation should be increased to that particular ministry because of its importance. Having said that, we look at the problem that ministry needs to tackle. Yeah, when you come in, what are the environmental problems that we have to tackle in Nigeria? We have the Niger Delta issue. We have erosion in the east. We have, vehicular pollution in Lagos. We have all sorts of desert encroachment. Lake Chad is drying up. Lake Chad is about 90% of what it was in the 60s. It's about 10% of what it was in the 60s. What are the concrete steps that the government is doing? I am aware that there is a Department of Climate Change, and there is a move to move that department into a commission. There is also some kind of, policy levels, national policy on climate change, and the rest of them. But I must tell you that we are extremely disappointed about government's inaction, towards tackling climate change. Even when you look at those policies, the policy does not only operate at the federal level. We do have actions that are supposed to be carried out by the state government. Take the issue of Lagos that I just mentioned. Lagos State, led the way when it introduced the vehicular emission testing. I can't remember whatever name. It's been branded so many names now. Now, that policy was supposed to support, the environment, to ensure that air pollution in Lagos is reduced. But it eventually was turned into a revenue-generating policy rather than an environmental policy. There are so many of such policies that the government needs to introduce. We talk about tankers explosion every day. We talk about oil spills every day. Nigeria, as of today, is still engaged in gas flaring. And you rightly pointed out that in Africa, I think we're the second, big polluters on this particular continent. So we are going to sign some of this treaty, but we are doing very, very limited at home. There is, part of the commitment even to the UNF is education. How much of public awareness are the government, conducting to let citizens know their roles and responsibility? To let them know what are the basic actions that I can do to reduce my carbon footprint. These are not happening in Nigeria, and I think we can wake the government up to do more.
Indeed. Well, the United Nations says it is time for nature, talking about preserving biodiversity, especially at a time of a pandemic such as this. And as far as this pandemic is concerned, we've seen the role of wildlife and illegal trading being genesis to its origin, some people would argue. Do you think that there are lessons we can learn from it? And we have also seen that there has been mixed impacts of this pandemic on the environment. Here in Nigeria, are there any impacts positive that we have recorded or negatives? What has been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our environment?
Well, see, to be very clear, I don't think we have been able to, see the nexus between the environment and the pandemic. Clearly, we have handled this pandemic very poorly. And so if we're talking about the environment and the pandemic, it looks as if you are just in another narrative. But clearly, the whole world now knows that there are diseases that are residents in some animal territories. and that if you interact with those territories, you will bring those diseases back into where we inhabit. If you also destroy those environment, there is a tendency that those birds, those animals will come back and interact with us. So if you don't interact with them, they will come if you destroy their abode. What I think the public health experts call the zoonotic diseases. So it is now the right time for the government, number one, to look at all those kind of animals and animal habitats. I know parts of Nigeria where you have, the bat colony. Some places in my own state, we used to have them as kids. We used to go there and even kill them for fun. Governments need to begin to look at that and how to educate the people. And of course, the issue of wildlife. There are jokes about people eating all sorts of food, whether we're the one now running stomach or as a result of those foods. These are issues. We don't need to wait for China to find their citizens for exporting or buying pangolin from Nigeria. What are our people doing at the airport? So those are critical issues also that are relating to the environment that we need to begin to engage ourselves about.
Right. Mr. Akin Oluwafemi, I just want to get your personal view about the future of all of this. The future of the fight against, climate change and its antecedents and what is happening in the world. The future of what the world will be in like probably 2050. We're beginning to see the signs now. For the first time, it rained on Christmas Day. It's raining in January now in Nigeria. That's climate change for you. It's staring at you in the face. What's going to be the future like if we don't do something and nip this in the bud?
I think I'll just start from a very, very unpeculiar terrain and then come back to climate. Locally, we are seeing move by governments to shrink the public space, the civil space for engagement. The current government is not allowing the people to freely express themselves on genuine concerns about their lives. And the more they allow the people to organize, peacefully and engage the government about those concerns, I think the more even the government can be strengthened to represent the people. For a government to think that you can't begin to muffle people's rights, human rights, environmental rights, and the rest of them, that will be a problem. Then you come back to the government itself, that the government should know that they are representative of the people, not representatives of corporations that are damaging our environment and our public health. When this government newly came in, they imposed a fine on some oil multinationals. Till date, we don't know what has happened to that. And so when you have that credibility and your people behind you, then you can also go as Africans, as Nigerians, as representatives of the Nigerian people, to go to the international community to look at the issue of climate change and then put on the global table how it's affecting us as a people, how it's affecting us as a continent. Tell them what you are also doing and then be able to demand ecological justice for your own people. I think that is the way to go, for our government in terms of representation and going to the global space to demand climate change.
Well, quickly, let me ask you, you were saying that you've not been able to establish a connection between the environment and COVID-19, but there was a report about how in northern India, the Himalayas, the snow-capped Himalayas, became visible for the first time in 30 years because of the COVID-19 lockdown. And once there was lockdown, the pollution cleared and people could see 200 kilometers away and see the Himalayas in the distance, which means that clearly if there is reduction in pollution, our world will be a safer place. But do you think that the objective...
I was addressing the question of whether the Nigerian government has learned anything in terms of environmental policy and COVID-19. globally, it's acknowledged in China, in India, that, even in the aviation industry, there is less pollution. But we need to say this, it has actually not led to significant reduction of the rising global temperature. And that because we can see that this is doable, now people are now beginning to, and I mean civil society groups, beginning to engage ourselves about, again, organizing around, the zero emission target, like 2050. I mean, because COVID-19 has now taught us that it is doable for us to pollute less, and then we can also begin to project towards a zero emission world.
Well, I see you've been critical of the Nigerian government. In Saudi Arabia, they are trying to build a coastal city that will be zero emission city, that will have no roads, that will not use fuel. And so some countries are pushing the frontiers. But what would you recommend specifically to the Nigerian government? Briefly, that's our last question.
Well, Doctor, the Minister for Petroleum Resources said Nigerians will soon begin to ride electricity vehicles, and I think everybody just laughed. I think this government needs to take the issue of climate change and environment much more seriously. Look, recently a governor, in Nigeria did a press briefing, and he said that even the Ogoni cleanup is done at the time that is politically convenient for this government. And so we now have to take the issue of environment out of political and corruption conveniency.
Well, we reduce everything to politics.
Of saving our people.
Well, thank you very much, Femi, for joining us on the Morning Show. Thank you very much indeed.